You finally had your spiritual awakening. The moment everything made sense, the universe felt alive, and your old life shattered, only to wake up days, weeks, or months later with no drive, no passion, and no idea what to do next. But wasn't enlightenment supposed to set you free? Carl Jung knew this dark side of awakening better than anyone, and the truth is, this emptiness isn't a mistake. It's a necessary collapse. A spiritual awakening cracks you open. It's euphoric, terrifying, and life-changing, but what no one warns you about is what comes after. The clarity fades. The routines that once motivated you now feel meaningless. Even your deepest goals seem hollow. You're not broken. You're in the shadow of transformation. Stay till the end, because what comes next will change everything. Carl Jung, the legendary psychologist, mapped this exact terrain. He understood that true awakening isn't just about light. It's about confronting the parts of yourself you've ignored, the ambitions you outgrew, and the painful rebirth required to find real purpose. If you're stranded in this void, Jung's wisdom reveals why it's happening and how to move forward. A spiritual awakening is like waking up from a dream you didn't realize you were in. It's a seismic shift in perception, where the stories you once believed about yourself, your purpose, and the world suddenly dissolve, leaving you raw and unanchored. This isn't just about feeling more spiritual or adopting new beliefs. It's an irreversible expansion of awareness that cracks open the illusion of separation. The ego, that familiar voice that told you who you were and what you should want, begins to loosen its grip. You see through the constructs that once felt solid, careers, relationships, even identity, and in their place, there's only vast, unsettling clarity. For many, this unraveling starts with a loss of interest in everything that once drove them. The ambitions that used to fuel late nights, promotions, validation, material success, now feel like costumes you can't remember why you wore. Hobbies, friendships, even passions may suddenly seem hollow, not because they're bad, but because they were never truly yours to begin with. They were scripts handed to you by culture, family, or an old version of yourself that no longer exists. This isn't depression, though it can feel like it. It's the quiet death of what Jung called the persona, the mask you built to survive a world you no longer recognize. Alongside this disintegration comes a deep, often painful sense of disconnection. Social norms, small talk, even the daily rhythms of life start to feel absurd. You might find yourself sitting in a room full of people, watching them chase things they think matter, while you feel like a ghost, present but untethered. This isn't arrogance, it's the collision between your expanded awareness and a society still operating on autopilot. The more awake you become, the harder it is to pretend. Relationships strain. Jobs feel suffocating. You're not rejecting life, you're grieving the one you outgrew. And then come the questions, the kind that keep you up at night. Why are we here? What's the point of anything? Existential dread isn't a side effect of awakening. It's the inevitable result of seeing reality without the buffer of illusion. The answers that used to comfort you, religion, productivity, distractions, no longer stick. This is where many get lost, mistaking the void for failure. But Jung would argue this crushing uncertainty is where real transformation begins. The ego's collapse isn't the end. It's the only way to rebuild something true. The journey of spiritual awakening often leads travelers into unexpected territory, a barren landscape where former drives and ambitions wither like plants deprived of sunlight. This bewildering loss of motivation isn't a failure of spiritual progress, but rather its inevitable shadow. Carl Jung's profound understanding of the psyche reveals why this occurs through his concept of the shadow, those rejected, unexamined aspects of ourselves that surface when our conscious identity begins to dissolve. As the bright light of awakening illuminates previously hidden corners of the psyche, we're confronted with a parade of disowned traits, suppressed desires, and unresolved wounds. This sudden emergence creates tremendous inner conflict. The parts of ourselves we've spent lifetimes avoiding now demand recognition, draining energy from external pursuits. The old motivations that once propelled us forward were often ego constructions, carefully crafted to win approval or security in a world we no longer perceive the same way. Yet in this intermediate space, where former goals have lost their luster but new purposes haven't yet crystallized, we're left floating in a disorienting limbo, too awake to return to sleep, but not yet grounded in a new mode of being. This dismantling of motivation stems largely from the ego's necessary dissolution, a process Jung recognized as essential for true psychological and spiritual maturation. The ego, that familiar sense of I that narrated our life story and set our ambitions, was never the totality of who we are, though it pretended otherwise. Its goals, achievement, status, accumulation, served important functions in our development, but after awakening, their inherent emptiness becomes glaringly apparent. We see through the cultural hypnosis that equated success with self-worth, yet find nothing immediately available to take its place. This is where Jung's concept of individuation becomes crucial, not as a return to ego-driven striving, but as a gradual, organic rebuilding of the self from a deeper foundation. The temporary loss of motivation is actually the psyche's way of creating space for authentic desires to emerge from the unconscious, rather than being imposed by societal conditioning or the false self. In this vulnerable transition period, what feels like apathy is often the soul's refusal to participate in inauthentic striving, a kind of psychic strike until we learn to act from integrity rather than fear or obligation. The confrontation with existential nihilism represents perhaps the most daunting challenge in this post-awakening landscape. When the constructed meanings of conventional life evaporate, we're left staring into the abyss, asking, why strive for anything at all? This isn't mere philosophical speculation, but a visceral experience that can paralyze even the most determined seeker. The trap lies in mistaking the deconstruction of false meanings for the absence of all meaning, a cognitive error that Jung spent his career addressing. His solution wasn't to retreat into comforting illusions, but to dive deeper into the unconscious through dream work, active imagination, and shadow integration. Jung discovered that authentic meaning doesn't come from transcending human experience, but from fully engaging with it. Paradoxically, by embracing our limitations, our darkness, and our humanity. The motivation that eventually returns after this dark night of the soul isn't the ego's ambition rebranded, but something far more resilient, a drive aligned with the totality of one's being, including those shadow elements we'd previously disowned. This explains why so many report that their post-awakening passions and projects feel qualitatively different. Less about proving oneself to the world, and more about expressing one's unique essence in service to something greater. The painful interim period of lost motivation, then, serves as the crucible in which our superficial drives are burned away to make room for purposes that can withstand the light of heightened awareness. One of the most seductive pitfalls on the spiritual path is the temptation to use awakening as an escape hatch from life's messy realities, a phenomenon modern psychology calls spiritual bypassing. After touching higher states of consciousness, many seekers develop a subtle aversion to ordinary human existence, dismissing earthly responsibilities, emotional wounds, and practical needs as unspiritual distractions from enlightenment. This creates a dangerous split where the transcendent is idealized while the immanent, our bodies, relationships, and societal obligations, is treated as inferior or illusory. Carl Jung saw this tendency as one of the greatest threats to genuine psychological and spiritual development, famously warning that spirituality which denies the human experience is incomplete. He understood that true transformation requires us to bring the light of awareness down into the valleys of our humanity, not just bask on the mountaintops of mystical experience. When we reject the full spectrum of what it means to be human in favor of an airbrushed spiritual identity, we create what Jung called inflation, a disembodied state where the ego ironically reasserts itself in new form, now disguised as an enlightened being too pure for worldly concerns. This spiritual bypass directly contributes to the motivational paralysis many experience after awakening. By devaluing practical action and human needs, we sever our connection to the very ground from which authentic motivation springs. Stagnation sets in when we wait passively for divine inspiration while neglecting the dishes, the bills, or the difficult conversations, all under the guise of surrendering to the universe. Jung would recognize this as a defense mechanism, a way to avoid the hard work of integrating spiritual realizations into daily life. The shadow aspects we refuse to acknowledge don't disappear. They simply move underground, manifesting as chronic lethargy, vague dissatisfaction, or even physical symptoms. Meanwhile, the spiritual ideals we cling to become increasingly abstract and disconnected from reality, leaving us stranded between worlds, too enlightened for ordinary life but not embodied enough to manifest our potential. This explains why some of the most awakened people paradoxically become the least functional, using spiritual concepts to justify avoidance rather than engagement. The antidote lies in what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold tension between opposites until a higher synthesis emerges. In practical terms, this means honoring both our spiritual nature and our human imperfections, both the call to expansion and the need for grounded action. Motivation returns when we stop trying to transcend our humanity and start embracing it as the very crucible of transformation. Paying the rent becomes as sacred as meditation when done with presence. Processing childhood wounds becomes spiritual work when approached with courage. The integration Jung advocated isn't glamorous. It's the slow, unsexy labor of weaving insights into the fabric of daily existence. But it's precisely this integration that transforms spiritual awakening from an escape into an embodied path, where meaning isn't found by rejecting life but by participating in it more fully. When we stop using spirituality as a bypass and start using it as a lens through which to engage all aspects of existence, we discover that motivation wasn't truly lost. It was simply waiting to be reborn in a form aligned with our deepest truth. The path to regaining motivation after spiritual awakening isn't about forcing yourself back into old patterns of striving, but rather about allowing a new kind of drive to emerge organically from your deepened awareness. Jung's approach begins with shadow work, that challenging but essential process of reclaiming the disowned parts of yourself that your spiritual journey may have initially led you to reject. Ironically, the very aspects you've judged as unspiritual, your ambition, your anger, your sensual desires, often hold the keys to your renewed vitality. When we split off these parts in pursuit of enlightenment, we create inner divisions that drain our energy. Jung discovered that what we resist persists, and what we repress expresses itself indirectly, often as lethargy or lack of direction. By courageously facing these shadow elements with curiosity rather than judgment, you begin to reclaim the psychic energy previously spent on keeping them at bay. This doesn't mean indulging every impulse, but rather acknowledging these aspects as valid parts of your wholeness. As you integrate them, you'll notice pockets of motivation returning, not the ego's desperate striving, but a more authentic drive emerging from your complete self. Beyond shadow work, Jung emphasized the importance of symbolic meaning in restoring motivation. In our rational world, we often dismiss dreams, synchronicities, and imagination as unimportant. Yet these are precisely the channels through which the unconscious communicates our true direction. Start paying attention to recurring images in your dreams, patterns in your daily life, and the activities that make you lose track of time. These are clues to your personal myth trying to emerge. Jung found that when we engage with these symbols through journaling, art, or active imagination, we activate archetypal energies that fuel us from deep within. Your lack of motivation may simply be your soul's way of rejecting prefabricated life paths in favor of one that's uniquely yours. By developing what Jung called a living relationship with the unconscious, you begin to discern between what you think you should want and what your deeper self is actually calling you toward. This symbolic approach transforms motivation from something you have to manufacture into something you discover and cooperate with. True motivation in the Jungian sense always involves this dual movement, honoring both your inner truth and your connection to the world. Many seekers make the mistake of either becoming so self-focused that they neglect contribution, or so outwardly focused that they betray their authenticity. The sweet spot emerges when you find ways to express your unique gifts in service to something larger than yourself. This doesn't require grand gestures. Even simple acts done with full presence can become sacred when aligned with this principle. Notice what stirs your compassion, what injustices ignite your fire. These are signposts to where your energy wants to flow. Jung's concept of individuation was never about solitary enlightenment, but about becoming who you're meant to be in relationship to the whole. Perhaps most importantly, Jung would remind us that the psyche operates on its own timeline. In our instant gratification culture, we expect quick fixes, but genuine transformation unfolds in seasons. The apparent lack of motivation you're experiencing may simply be the necessary fallow period before new growth. Rather than forcing productivity, practice what Jung called active waiting, staying engaged with the process through small, manageable steps while allowing the larger integration to happen organically. Keep showing up for simple routines, honor your body's needs, and trust that as you do the inner work of shadow integration and symbolic exploration, your outer motivation will gradually realign. This patience isn't passive, it's the wisdom to recognize that the soul cannot be rushed. The motivation that eventually emerges from this process will feel different, less frantic, more sustainable, and deeply rooted in your authentic being. What feels like a loss now is actually the clearing away of false motivations to make space for what truly matters. What you're experiencing, this profound loss of motivation, this unsettling void where drive and ambition once lived, isn't a sign that your spiritual awakening has failed you. Quite the opposite. It's evidence that the transformation is working exactly as it should. Carl Jung's wisdom reminds us that every genuine spiritual journey moves through seasons of darkness and disorientation, where old structures must crumble before new ones can take root. The motivational drought you're weathering now is the necessary death of what was never truly yours, the borrowed ambitions, the conditioned striving, the ego's desperate attempts to prove your worth. This emptiness isn't your enemy. It's sacred ground being cleared for something more authentic to emerge. Remember, this is a phase of becoming, not a permanent state of being. Just as winter always gives way to spring, this period of apparent stagnation is secretly rich with invisible growth. Beneath the surface of your awareness, your psyche is doing its most important work, reorganizing, integrating, and preparing you for a level of purpose you couldn't previously imagine. The motivation that will eventually return won't be the anxious striving of before, but something more resilient and deeply rooted, a quiet fire that burns steadily because it's fed by your soul's true calling rather than society's expectations. You're not losing yourself. You're finally finding the version of yourself that doesn't need to be constantly motivated because it's simply aligned. If this journey resonates with you, you're not alone. Many of us have walked this exact path of awakening only to find ourselves paralyzed by the very enlightenment we sought. But here's the beautiful truth. Your story could be the light that guides someone else through their own dark night of the soul. Share your experiences in the comments below. What have you discovered about motivation after awakening? What questions are still living in your heart? Your voice matters in this collective unfolding of consciousness. Together, we're rewriting what it means to be spiritually awake in a world that needs our authentic presence more than ever. The path continues, and your next chapter is already being written, not by the old you that was always chasing, but by the wiser you that's learning to be called.